Abalo, Okello. I am the team leader at Precision Hub Consults. I shared with us during our recap session a bit what we do as a firm for purposes of just making sure everyone is on the same page. Some of us joined after we had left that our 1 hour sort of reflection. As a firm, we support the M&E functions, look at it from the holistic space of M&E, from the point of design to the point of telling the story, at a point of documentation that we call knowledge management. Among the things that we support agencies with. We also support agencies from a point of data-driven project designs. So we support from a point of review of where you were and where you want to design a new program from. It usually takes human-centered design. We usually encourage partners that we design projects with, and depending on the data sufficiency that you have, for us to be able to also do a sort of barriers analysis to just fit in some of the things that you are already doing, and also borrowing from the lens of what are the other players doing also in the space. But also among the things that we have learned supporting designs in country, but also in the neighboring East Africa, is to just think sustainability at the point of policy. After we have done all this that we do, where do we fit into the policy space so that all your gains are not lost and project close out? So those are some of the conversations that we get in when we get into project design with partners. But we also do documentation, project documentation, through our knowledge management unit, what other organizations traditionally call the communications unit. We help in documentation processes, doing capacity building for your teams, on how do you tell the best story, how do you write the best success stories, the most significant change stories, how does that process take? So encouraging a methodology that is now pronounced to be used in USAID funded projects, that is called the outcome harvesting methodology, that gives you the gist of the richness of what your project should look like in the end, right from the point of design. But for purposes of intentionally just focusing on what this today is all about, we are here to share the findings of the baseline, a special baseline I want to say, that we had for the project. So this is an introduction that is already known to us, but just to re-echo and put us back into the thinking space of the project. We all know that this project is aimed at promoting sustainable crops and animal value chains in the West Nile sub-region through identification and strengthening of associations that are engaged in the selected value chain systems, through market systems analysis and strengthening direct market linkages, promoting climate smart agriculture, providing technical assistance services, and better quality inputs. And by those, the project refers to this as approved seeds, approved quality farm tools, providing productive infrastructure, regular extension support services, farmer-to-farmer learning exchange visits, joint technical support with the local governments and the relevant livelihood actors in the project locations. I picked an interest in just bringing back that introduction because of what the data told us, yeah? And appreciating that from the findings, eventually we then realized that some of the things that traditionally get sidelined in project design, that are usually actually almost no cost, got missed out, that even when we had implemented for a year or so, some of these things that we almost have no budget attachments, having missed them in the theoretical thinking of design, somehow affected some of the statistics that the data showed us, and it could help us in planning for the next phase. So I'll not re-echo the two outputs, the high-level components, but before we set out for the field, we had a hypothesis that we benchmarked on. We appreciated that even when this was a baseline, we understood that project beneficiaries had statistically, we would say, had been contaminated in a way. So by contamination meaning they have already received some dose of implementation, so it would skew some of the findings to a certain thinking pattern. But also at the time of the assessment, some of the partners were already at the point when the contracts have to be reviewed. So engagement at field level and even access to some of the respondents was quite a challenge, but we eventually found ways with the support of your teams and the leadership from the different partner agencies that work with Ayuda to give us what we are able to share about this morning. In terms of methodological alignment, we adopted a cross-sectional study design where we utilize a mixed survey methodology, and we basically did the qualitative and quantitative methods of data collection, where we had the in-depth questionnaires where we interacted with respondents on one-on-one. Then in terms of the qualitative, we did have focus group discussions, but also key informants with critical identified stakeholders that are our partners in the decision-making of the project. We also did quite an amount of document review, appreciating that beyond reviewing the documents that were shared with us from your different agencies, from Ayuda, we looked at the design documents, we looked at some of the available frameworks that we could interact with, and from the missing pieces, we also tried to review livelihood, looking at the larger livelihood agenda for emergency space thinking, localization, where are we going as a country, to even just think after 5 years from now, how do we want our programs to inform policy at the country level, given that the localization agenda has just taken off at country level. To just give us a bit of a snapshot into the high-level indicator values, that's what the statistics showed us. So when you just look at the statistical run of the high-level indicators that we had, I can happily say that this gave us confidence to still report these as baseline values, because the statistics are not all we are running above 90 for us to say we are contaminated enough to start thinking revision and implementation strategy. So when we interacted with the project beneficiaries, you can clearly see that if the beneficiaries we are working with have an average monthly income of less than, almost an equivalent of less than $100, even less than $50 in a month. As not sidelining that when we are prorating other sources of income and livelihoods, they may not necessarily have to be benchmarking incomes, but they have other sources of survival that they're not able to attach money value for. So I had Walter make mention that we had another assessment that I want to believe had the ability to prorate some of the other attributes that you can then aggregate the financial standard of that household, valuing from the assets, the land that they have and all that, that would give us a certain hike into the status of those households. But in terms of incomes, this is what we could be able to pull out from the beneficiaries that we currently work with. Then a critical indicator that the project also responds to is to just understand the percentage of people who are employed and earning an income. And the statistics give us about 6 to 3. And when you talk about 6 to 3, that can give you a certain understanding that our beneficiaries are actually doing well because they have a source of income. But then when you interact with the value attached to the income, it then gives you reason to think, what strategies do we want to actually adopt better? So when I was listening into the reflections that we were having, then we're thinking, some of us were talking VSLAs, and we also have the groups, the youth that we're working with, in terms of sustainability and livelihoods. Where do we want to integrate youth into groups? What are some of the activities we want to do with the youth in groups? When we talk about the VSLA methodology, How can we use the VSL methodology to also integrate the broader spectrum of the work that we do? So basically looking at groups as an avenue for empowerment, to think empowerment in the broad benchmark of livelihoods, but since at the national level the country is now going for the parish model, how do we even fit into the parish model and say, this is where our strength, this is where our beneficiaries are, and how do we supplement what the parish model is already doing? Because the parish model, I can confidently talk about the parish model because we designed the parish model with the Ministry of Gender when the whole spectrum was starting and the conversation on gender equality, promoting the gender equality framework and women empowerment and the we agenda for Ministry of Gender. Then that's when the conversation of the parish model came in through Ministry of Gender and Ministry of Finance and the flagship project then when the president eventually, the cabinet eventually passed it. So how then can we utilize some of the structures that already government has passed and still implement at low cost, but have sufficient gains, whether we are going to strengthen our abilities in support supervision, quality assurance for project implementation. Among the limitations that the parish development model currently has is it did not strongly design on how do you handle issues of women empowerment within the model. So if we are talking livelihoods in Uganda and appreciating that when we eventually interact with the data, the detailed report, you realize the role women play in the livelihood sector is very critical in the initial stages. But when we get to the level of sales of products, then the woman is dying out. So that's where issues of GBV are then integrating in. So how do we even fix those issues that eventually come and affect the results to eventually take us to the next level? In terms of the component that has the youth programming, about 95% of the youth are currently self-employed. Yeah? But when you look at the depth, the qualitative component, beyond them looking at themselves as currently self-employed, are they able to then sustain themselves beyond 15 days into the new month? The qualitative components could hardly speak into that. So it means even when we are talking about self-employment, how do we strengthen capacity building? Because Ugandan businesses are known to collapse within the first 5 years of engagement, but even when you get to the youth, almost every 2 years they are having a new approach, or I want to do something different. So their businesses are not even sustainable. But if we are to work with them on long-term projects, how do we then not lose the gains of project implementation, rather than measuring the numbers of, these are the number of the youth we got into employment as a result of the beautiful projects we designed? How do we stay afloat? And even beyond our project's lifespan, how do we stay on, how can our visibility stay if post-evaluations were to be done? So that's a thinking that we can all have in the room and have a point of discussion on that over time. Then the other indicator, which is the percentage of farmers who practice climate smart agriculture or improved agricultural technologies. The statistics showed a somewhat 36%, clearly below average. And if we are talking about improved livelihoods, we know that very much so, we need these people to access climate information in one way or another. And because of the access to climate information, then it informs the practice that they eventually have to adopt. We'll see some of those details into the detailed slides, and hopefully we have also had a chance to read the detailed report that we shared. Then in terms of the percentage of households with sustainable access to the basic basket of food, it's only 44%, meaning that our communities, even when we talk livelihoods, either whatever they produce, they end up selling it all. And then we talk about food sufficiency. We are not able to realize that. So how do we still promote some of the handy foods, how the storage for foods for the time period of hunger, how prepared are they? When you look at the detailed report, we're able to pull out what are those critical months where we see periods of hunger, and at what point do we prepare the farmers, and points of reflection for them to know that as since we know that the period between June to August is the period we are going to experience hunger, how will we better prepare for the next year from the lessons that we have learned? So that's a call for all of us as development partners to start thinking aloud. Do we still want to see our beneficiaries saying the same story from the previous year? Then in terms of percentage of households with access to clean energy, it was 31%. And to our understanding, this is an area that was now being embedded at the time of the assessment. And so it justifies the low value in starts. And our understanding is it's one of the priority areas that the program wanted to adopt going forward. So because I have a number of slides, some of these basic background stats, I may not, if you could permit me, I will not run through them a lot, but I could pick out in terms of the nationality of the refugees that the program is primarily engaging with, and then we could also pick on the length of time they have been in countries. So just having refugees within your setting for more than 12 months is a sign that you can sustain them through the project implementation period. So you can actually design critical livelihood programs for the emergency setting and still be able to measure yourself against them beyond the project life, because they'll still be around. But we also picked, when you're talking livelihoods and empowerment, the assessment was interested in just understanding the disability classification. So we ran the Washington set of questions with the community, just to understand what does disability look like. Because from disability, then it helps you understand the functionality and the ability to sustain themselves in the space when we're talking the broad spectrum of livelihoods beyond the garden, beyond the off-farm activities that they engage in, but are they able to get to the place of value chain by the function of their disability measurements. So this is what they start. So as in terms of visual impairment, about 41% have somewhat of difficulty, and then 8% reported high level of difficulty. So when you aggregate, almost tells us that from just a sample of the respondents, almost 5 in every 10, which is almost half the group of beneficiaries we deal with, have some sort of visual impairments. So in terms of programming, when we're thinking integration, how do we start partnerships, how do we start referrals, or some of those things that we are not able to do as us, but how can we work with those that are strong in health and may not be within our catchments? How do we work with the government arms within the districts where we are operating, and even at the national level to start informing policy for disability inclusion in livelihoods? How does that play out for us? That's part of the reason I really want to spend some time on just the disability assessment according to what the Washington set of questions were able to tell us. Then in terms of hearing impairment, somewhat difficulty was 35%, and then those who say they have a lot of difficulty were only 3%. Then difficulty, when you talk about mobility, somewhat difficult 46%, very difficult 6%. Then in terms of memory, concentration and all that, somewhat difficult 42% and the other 4%. In terms of self-care, 10 and 18. And then use of the customary language, what kind of difficulty they have. So all this informs how negotiations in the marketplace happen. So you could clearly tell that in terms of use of the local language, they don't have any difficulty. So in terms of negotiating prices for their products, it's something that they would ably do. I think in the detailed report we have an index value of what the whole aggregate of then disability would look like. But in terms of special interest, we thought as partners and also the program thinking the big picture, we could start now the conversations in the different technical working groups to start thinking how can, from our space of what data is telling us, can we position for policy conversations to start integrating health into livelihoods, even when we're not going to be the ones implementing them directly? How can the health sector be held accountable for some of the results that we want to see in the long term if we must have a sustainable country? So diving into now speaking the livelihood language. So we went into the space of livestock, and these are some of the highlights that the benchmarks, the main reasons our beneficiaries keep their livestock. About 87% say they keep the livestock for incomes, basically for sale, and then about 76% also say they keep some of these animals for food production. But when you go into the nitty-gritties of what the details will speak into, you'd realize that even those who are saying they keep the animals for consumption, it's probably 5 birds in a year, it's probably 10 ducks in a year. It wasn't that much, yeah? So it spoke into the nutrition components of these households, because then we could tell the nutrition intake for these households and the possibility of having malnutrition if nutrition assessments were to be done. Something from the data would tell us otherwise, because when we moved in these households, in terms of just thinking abroad, it was hard to find high level of protein intake, and the data could also tell us that the consumption of carbohydrates and vegetables was high up there. But you'd also understand it because of the geographical space, because most of the animals we are keeping, we are actually selling them out. So when we are thinking livelihoods, because we also need them strong to be able to run the livelihoods agenda, and where you can be able to say they are contributing to the food basket of the country to this magnitude, they need to also be able to self-care, have self-care at their households as important. Then, because keeping animals for sale was pronounced, we went ahead and ran some basic stats on what are some of the animal products that they sell. So we saw chicken contributed highly, about 6-8%. We're selling out their birds, then they're selling the eggs, they're selling the milk, and also the meat. Then in terms of who is responsible for the products when they're sold, so basically you're looking at the money attributes. You see the husbands, almost 50%, have the high say in the what's next after the sale. So when you're thinking issues of gender and GBV afterwards, you see that this is where you want to start having the conversations. At what point do you want to see shared responsibility? So that thinking from the point as the program, can we start thinking bigger than what does our gender framework look like? The gender and disability inclusion, what would it look like as a program? So coming from the high level to then having partners adopting it at the level of implementation, so that we are having one piece that we eventually measure what the gender space looks like for us, but also appreciating that as we are doing a gender and disability inclusion framework, how does it align to the national framework, as we can be able to ably speak into the place of policy. When we were having our reflection outside, I seem to have snapped into a conversation around issues around transport for the beneficiaries. And for us, it also spoke to us significantly that after we have done all this production, how do we get our products to the market? Yeah, and data clearly showed us that transportation is a major challenge. So if transportation is a major challenge, it's going to affect the pricing of the products our beneficiaries are going to eventually have. Because I can't transport my products to the market, I am going to have to sell to only redeem what capital I put in. So it ceases to become a money-making venture for them. And yet it's almost the only option that they have. You want to sell off so that you can you can have some capital to start, rather your products will also get damaged in the process of storage. So looking into the broad picture, how can we start thinking linkages for as a program? How do we start having conversations of linkages? But even with partners that we may not be working with at the moment, that probably have created the linkage platforms and access to some of this information. And when I thought about this particular slide, then I thought about a partner that I think has an app. How can we even use that app to have embedment of components of linkage for our beneficiaries to know if I have my products ready on this app, I am able to sell my products probably outside of the current geographical scope. How does this fit for us? So thinking how to create a hybrid amendment to the app, just thinking aloud for us to think through. In terms of agronomic practices that the beneficiaries have, this is what the stats showed us. So you realize that in terms of soil and water conservation, about 79% in Adjumani, 33% in Obongi, 60% in Okello, and then Terego reporting, that is, okay, the blue looks so close. Okay, Terego is only 32%. So when you look at the different practices that we have there, like row planting, pest disease management, crop management, use of agriculture, irrigation, use of solar irrigation, and name it. Thinking beyond just what the statistics are currently telling us, and I'm sure if we get a chance to look into the deep ends of the report, the big question now for us is, we see significant variations across districts, yeah? What does that then mean to us? And when you look at the introductory part of the program, it clearly tells us that we're supposed to have exchange visits. How are they able to learn from the practices across? Is this something we want to have with the extension workers? Do we want to have a standard capacity building manual that they adopt across board? And that capacity building manual, can it also have a standard support supervision manual where you know if Global Aim is doing support supervision, it's a standard framework that's being used by SEPOD. It's a standard benchmark that's being used by all partners, so that we're able to have Fanta in Global Aim and not Fanta in a Coca-Cola bottle in with another partner when the design is the same. So thinking aloud from that benchmark will help us have, even when measurements are being done, we're able to know that we are measuring ourselves from a standard, because our implementations have also been standardized. Then, what agro-processing services do they employ most commonly? This is what the stats were able to tell us. The milling services, so I'll just use the index values because it gives you the average of all the districts. Milling services took a high percentage. I had someone make a joke that our president is a promoter of cassava. And you could tell within the milling services, we had a high percentage of refining of cassava into flour. Then we also had quite a high percentage of our beneficiaries dealing in maize, and then the millet, the sorghum, and all that. So it clearly tells you. But now when you're thinking about value chain, yeah, now that we know that we are a high production chain for some of these products, the linkage space should now be coming strongly for us, that how do we add value and allow these people to actually sell beyond the geographical scope where there's already too much production, so it could affect how the value for their prices would happen from the local area where they're currently engaging. So then we went ahead and looked at the cooling and storage facilities. So thinking in the broad spectrum, if West Nile and then the actually sub-region that we are currently focusing on. If we want to go big in terms of animal meats, we don't have the capacity for storage for us to be able to sell outside of the region. So it means if these services were to be taken, let's say, to Kampala and to the major towns that currently consume high bulk of meat, in terms of capacity, we can't yet reserve these products to reach when they are fresh in those locations. So it also informs the pricing that we're going to have for the meat, because we notice many of us, when we're traveling from the field to go to Kampala, the price you pay for the chicken from this side and the price you pay from the other side is almost 200% on the other side. So it means actually, in terms of value, this person is not being built, but of course, as we are buying, we are buying as consumers. We're now no longer buying as the programmers. But can we start also reflecting through as that is happening? I'm not saying price them, pay them more what you'd pay if you were to buy the chicken from Kampala, but how can we use that information to then start integrating it in the programming that we do? How can those conversations get to the technical working groups and eventually into the policy spaces that our beneficiaries eventually are being supported? Then heating and drying, Happy says about 32%, then transportation 44%, not forgetting the challenges we have talked about. So this, in terms of the young people talking about being employed or earning an income at household level, about 63% reported that they are actually earning something. So that comes from the aggregate of all the different trades that we saw as main occupation from the other side. Then the household main source of income in the last 6 months. So we're trying to correct in terms of appreciating the dry spells and when periods of scarcity come out. So we prioritize 6 months because it will give us the best memory for the respondents. So in the last 6 months, by the time of assessment, so it implies that was a space of operation for the beneficiaries from June of last year to December. So that's a period that they responded for. Casual labor was 15%, day labor at construction sites 19%, food aid from humanitarian agencies was 21%. That pushes us to the point of where we saw dependency syndrome for our beneficiaries. Some of them were still relying on remittances from their relatives. A number of them, about 15%, were still taking loans from BSLA groups as a source of income. So if a loan is being treated as a source of income, that's also a big quest for us to think through for these young people. Youth who are planning business or to be self-employed or to run a business over time. So interestingly, about almost all of them, I would say, 95% are saying they would want to start a business. So beyond wanting, we wanted to know, do they have the funds to start? It's one thing to want, but you have. And we noticed that over 80% don't have the startup, but they are interested in starting. So it then takes us back to the basics. After you've wanted to start a business, but you don't have the funds, do you have, first of all, the capacity intellectually? Have you been trained to just think through, don't just jump in and then the business is closing in less than 1 year? So those are some of the things we'd leave for us in the room to discuss after this presentation. Now, you realize I tried to reduce the number of graphics that would share in terms of data because we have a bigger report that we could talk through. We just probably forgot to inform Walter to have printed for us copies of the report. It would have helped us have a deeper conversation. But beyond, after interacting on the overall, this is what we picked out from the baseline, our hybrid baseline. And looking at what the data they came out with and thinking through the implementation strategies that all of us as partners have, and thinking the bigger spectrum from Ayuda as the fund manager or the funder for the program from a larger viewpoint. In terms of limitations that we saw is that as a program we didn't have a unified M&E plan. We reviewed the different M&E plans and trying to integrate it to the national level at Ayuda was a bit of a challenge. So we then recommended that if, as partners, eventually we would have one large M&E plan that then informs if Stafford is going to do support supervision for their component, can it be borrowed from the national level or the program level M&E plan? And how does that fit within the M&E plan as an agency that Stafford is also having? We also realized that the program itself lacked program design standards. All designs were independent. Everyone's design was independent. So as you're reviewing, you have to find points of integration. So it also affects, and we realize that itself can give more review time for Ayuda to have to adopt and pick out what are the success points from the partners. But even when we interacted with the different reports, which we did, I think, provide as a recommendation here, is the need for all of us as partners to train our teams on quality report writing. So writing report from a results-based point of view and not from an activities point of view, because we saw that very pronounced across board. We're mainly reporting on activities and not what does the result tell me and what do I do with what the result is actually telling me. But all that would fit within a unified M&E system as a component for reporting. Then among the dependents also realized there's a high dependency on food aid, and yet we appreciate that when scarcity happens, they are also selling away the foods that they get. So that itself becomes a nutrition need for them to be sensitized about, but it's something that we may not realize the results for in 1 year or 2 years, because it's a practice that has been there longer than we can envision or talk about when in this engagement. Then critical for us when I think in value chain is the limited access to financial services. So while some beneficiaries belonged to VSLAs, the access to financial services was still limited. And beyond that, financial inclusion didn't seem to have a module that was integrated in the design components. So VSLAs have been created with hybrids of how the VSLA methodology being implemented here is different from the standard VSLA methodology. So we then thought, how does a partnership work with agencies like CARE, that is known as the mother of VSLAs, because it's their mandate to ensure that VSLAs are being implemented as the traditional VSLAs, and there is usually no cost implication for CARE to do some of these trainings for partners, provided they're informed. It's just created within their work plan. So just thinking aloud, if it's something that we want to borrow for enhancing our VSLA methodology, because right now, partners like CARE and now have taken VSLA to digital VSLA. So it has gone on an app, which is also, I think, in technology. It has been translated into the local languages, a good platform for us to start thinking digitalization when we are talking livelihoods. Then the disability and gender inclusion programming gap that we saw, I don't have to really re-echo that. We have pretty much talked through it through the presentation. But also for us to appreciate, when we went to collect data, there was something we appreciated differently from Lamore district was there was a bit of limitation and inconsistency on follow-up of the project beneficiaries. Because when we got to the field, our teams were actually chased by the community because they felt we had, as partners, we are not engaged with them very closely. But we also appreciated that during that time, it was a time when reflections on the 1 year contract was happening. And we thought it wise that going forward, when we are thinking transition from communities, they need to also be informed of any gaps that or any delays that may be happening, or can we have continuity of some of the activities as we're waiting the funds for the next period as partners, because we know that this is a long-term relationship that we already have with Ayuda. In terms of recommendations, are basically, I think I've talked through them when I was talking through the challenges I integrated. That's what I can share the snapshot into the best. Thank you.